is the Four Noble Truths. And I thought that maybe I can try to be more informal, not be very traditional, and I think I will try to be a little, try to think maybe not so precisely, but be more relaxed in my thinking. So I will have that liberty, and with that I will just talk. The Four Truths, as you all know, is the central theme of Buddha Dharma, you could say. It's the central theme of Buddha's teachings. And when the Buddha gave his first teachings, of course, he gave the teaching about the Four Noble Truths. After attaining enlightenment, after 7 weeks of enlightenment, then Buddha gave his first teachings, and the Buddha didn't go around and said that people should believe him or that people should take refuge in him because that he has now become enlightened, But rather, the Buddha taught about these 4 points, and he called them truths, It's not something that's dogmatic, it's not something that he sort of made up, but rather they are truths. And of course, when he began to share these truths, these experiences, he began with suffering. He didn't begin from some high level, but he began with our current situation. And the term suffering, sometimes I think it is sometimes misunderstood. People start to think that Buddhism is somewhat negative, a bit cynical, because they always talk about suffering, right? Suffering in a Buddhist context does not only refer to a feeling, it does not refer to a particular negative emotion or a negative set of feeling, but rather, when we say suffering, we are referring to something, we are referring to a state where everything is not perfect, That's what we are referring to when we say suffering. Of course, we want things to go in our way, but we don't always have it our way, right? And that's suffering, that it's something that's not fully pleasant. It's not something that's completely satisfactory. Then we have to come up with a term, so someone decided to call it suffering, because suffering is something that we all can associate as being something that's unpleasant, that's not satisfactory, right? So we use this term, and then we try to apply that. We try to apply that onto our world. We try to apply that to everything that we experience, that we see. But in the end, that don't give us a full satisfaction, That leaves perhaps room for improvement, So, when we talk about suffering, one very important aspect of suffering is impermanence, For each truth, there are 4 aspects or 4 attributes. And the first of the 16 attribute is impermanence. And this is a very important concept or an important reality in Buddhism. It's, even if you try not to think of impermanence, it's still there, You cannot hide from the fact that things are impermanent, that things change. So, for us to think of suffering, to think about suffering, then it's imperative that we begin with impermanence, And if you look at the impermanent nature of things, then gradually, then that understanding will lead to seeing how things are not really 100% satisfactory, that how they can change from one state to another. And through this, then this will gradually lead us to understanding suffering. So, impermanence is very important. We all know, at least on a conceptual level, we know that things are impermanent, but we don't really devote much time thinking about impermanence, We know that not everything is satisfying. We know that not everything gives an everlasting satisfaction, but we don't think of the fact that that is not the case. So then, why isn't there a thing that gives this everlasting satisfaction, Why isn't there such a thing? That very nature of wanting a thing that gives us full satisfaction leads us to even being more unsatisfied, right? And that's one big problem. That's one big problem. So it's the wanting bit that contributes to even more suffering. And as with the 6 types of suffering and the 8 types of suffering, how in the world nothing is definite, nothing is everlasting, and then thinking about the various types of unpleasantness that we have to experience in our everyday life, then it is clear that something is wrong, right? That there is a problem. So this is very important in the first step, and then the next step is why are we going through this process? Why are we experiencing this? And then if you analyze, then it is clear that this suffering is not external, Of course, we can have lots of material possessions. We can have fame, wealth, all the worldly things. But even having all of that doesn't make us really happy. And I think if you look around, then there are many examples of that. Being prosperous doesn't really equal being happy. So this suffering part is not something external. And then, if you think about it, then it's clear that it's in our mind. Hello? That this suffering is mainly coming on a mental level, right? It's not coming from an external source. It might be sort of conditioned by external sources, but it's really coming from one's experiences. Yeah? And then, if you think of those experiences, then most of that will be on the level of emotions, right? So we have like 2 emotions on two opposite ends, which is primarily desire and anger, right? Desire and anger. And then again, if you analyze those 2 emotions, then of course desire comes from viewing an object that is pleasant, and anger arises out of viewing or coming into contact with an unpleasant object. But just merely seeing an pleasant object or an unpleasant object doesn't mean that desire or anger will arise. So then there's got to be a third cause, not just the object, but there has to be another cause. And from the Buddhist perspective, then desire and anger they are not only do they see an pleasant attribute or an unpleasant attribute, but they are superimposing, they arise from this superimposition of an object really having this essential negative attribute or having an essential unpleasant aspect, from the object. So we call that ignorance. Ignorance is what gives rise to these two extreme emotions. So somehow that in our view, in our worldview, we see things as though they truly exist, as if they really have an essential quality, an essential aspect. And when you see things like that, and when you then see it as being an essential, pleasant object, then desire arises. And when you have that ignorance, and then when you see an object as though it has an unpleasant quality to it, then anger arises. So this is this is why we suffer, right? Because of the three mental poisons. So, with desire, anger, and ignorance, and then we commit actions. We commit karma. Karma is action, and out of those three mental poisons, then we commit actions. So the kileshas, the mental afflictions, and the karma, they are the cause of suffering. And then what is the way out? Then, of course, it is nirvana, liberation. And liberation here, of course, refers to the cessation of the causes of suffering. We all want to be happy, right? But many times we have different ideas of what it means to be happy. Yeah? And if we don't have a good grasp of what true happiness is, then we again will make those mistakes of not really comprehending what happiness really is, or what suffering really is. Because if you know what suffering really is, then you are not very far from knowing what true happiness is, right? And if you know what true happiness is, then you would have to know what suffering really is. So, getting a good idea of what happiness is or what suffering is very important. And the Buddha shared his views, what he thought of what suffering really is, or why we suffer, or what happiness really means, or what happiness really is. That is something that he shared, and if we can also try. We can, we should not, of course, sort of like accept it because the Buddha said so, but rather we should, try to see for ourselves, that we should analyze, that we should try to see if those words are true or not, and of course that we have to use our own experiences. We cannot always refer to our text, that we have to, that the base of all those investigation, has to start with our experience. And of course we have enough experiences, and we can use those experiences to analyze. This is very important. And with the fourth truth, which is the right path, the path to cessation, there are different categorization of paths that lead to cessation, but mainly it's important to have the right view. It's important to have the wisdom. So what is wisdom or what is right view? Here we are referring to a correct view of anatman or emptiness, shunyata. And why is this important? Because when we were talking about desire and anger and how and those two root cause is ignorance. So ignorance is the main cause of our suffering. So how do we overcome that? How do we overcome ignorance? Then we have to stop what ignorance is grasping. We have to sort of go against that. We have to sort of like revolt against ignorance. So we have to sort of look the other way, where ignorance is looking, right? So that's why the concept of shunyata is very important. And without thinking of shunyata, or without thinking on shunyata, without the right view, then it is impossible to overcome ignorance, So this is very important. And again, when it comes to the right view, then this shunyata or anatman, which is translated as no self, I think when people first come into contact with Buddhism and hear these words like anatman, right? Shunyata. Anatman is no self, and shunyata is, I think, emptiness. Then I think people might get the wrong idea, So anatman or no self, of course, does not mean that we don't exist, that there is no experiences. Of course, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that the self, as when we say myself or yourself, we are not saying that does not exist. We are not negating that. And likewise, when we say shunyata, when we say emptiness, we're not really saying that things don't exist. We're not saying that. So emptiness or no self is not nihilistic in that way. But what we are doing is that in the case of like ignorance or the world according to ignorance, what we are saying is that things don't exist as ignorance perceives things to be, right? And that's what the no self and emptiness are referring to, that even though everything exists, that they don't have an essential quality to them, that they are empty of this truly existing nature that is its intrinsic quality. So we are primarily referring to the negation of just that and nothing more. So just merely getting like in some understanding of that is not enough, that we may know something, like we might have an idea about something, but that doesn't mean that will bring about some change, some change. So what is important is that we must also have a strong motivation to bring about this change, right? Therefore, that we must have renunciation, and this is the method aspect. The method aspect. So, with the method aspect and the wisdom aspect, then that will bring about some change. Going back to the right view, many times people think that they have realized emptiness, because they go to teachings or they see in the text, and that they have been in this environment for many, many years, and then they feel like, I've realized emptiness, But realizing emptiness, of course, is a very difficult thing. It's not easy as it sounds. Because in the sutras, it says that emptiness is beyond conception, right? And many of our understanding is on a conceptual level. And conceptual thoughts, by their nature, have this habit of perceiving whatever that it perceives to be true. Right? And because of that, then even though when we try to conceptualize emptiness, when we try to understand it, somehow our mind then again tries to perceive an inherent quality, it perceives it automatically. So someone could try to conceptualize the house as being empty of this inherent quality, but as they are thinking this, as they are conceptualizing this, then that very conceptual thought would perceive the house being inherently empty as being true. The fact that this house is really empty of an inherent quality is, again, to the mind, it appears as something very real, something as having something as having an inherent quality. So that is how we interpret that word, that phrase, emptiness is beyond conception. I think maybe I will now just go to questions and answers, and I think with when I get questions, it's more helpful for me, and then that sort of like gives me a direction. So perhaps we could begin with some questions now. So if there's anyone who would like to ask a question or share something, please. Yes.
So if there's no perception of emptiness, if there's no perception of emptiness, what is it that the feeling of being in emptiness? What is it that conceives emptiness when you're in emptiness?
Can you start again?
If there is no perception of emptiness,
If there is no perception of emptiness,
what is it that conceives the emptiness?
oh, interesting question. Yes. Okay. First of all, I think there is a perception of emptiness, like when you infer emptiness, conceptually, there is of course a perception of emptiness, right? You are perceiving emptiness, but at the same time, you are also perceiving something that is like the opposite of emptiness at the same time. Yeah? And I give that example that, to the mind to the conceptual mind that sees, that perceives the house as being empty, of course does not perceive the house as truly holding an identity, right? But nevertheless, it still perceives its main object, which is the house, which is the emptiness of house, or the house being empty. It perceives that as holding a true identity, holding a true nature. So with one object, of course, the consciousness does not perceive one single object to be truly existing and again being empty of having that true existence. At the same time, it's no mind can perceive like that, but still that conceptual thought can perceive the house as being empty, but the emptiness of the house as being truly existing. Yeah? So there's a difference there. So it's not one object, but we differentiate between the main object. Of course, the main object it perceives as being truly existing, but I could say, I think the object of observation, that is house or a table, a car, whatever, and that it would perceive as being empty of having a true nature. Yeah. Okay. More questions? Yes?
Knowing the nature of the mind, suffering, desire, anger, ignorance is an effect of accumulation of beginningless of time karmas, and now I'm in the human form, and I experience suffering. I want to not be affected by my actions from the past, and yet I feel like I am inevitably suffering because I have to pay off those karmas that I am now reaping. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on how to not be so affected by my past actions so that I can have a still mind, less scattered, so the meditation is more favorable and more conducive to helping others as well as to raising my consciousness.
Of course, like with the mind, with the nature of mind, how that there is no starting point, for the mind. That it's you could try to go back and go back and go back, and you would never come to that end point, right? That beginning point, that starting point. And because of that, then yes, we have accumulated endless merits, yeah. But if you try to go back in time, you can go forever, right? If you again try to look forward, then again the mind will not stop. Consciousness does not stop. So then we have accumulated endless karmas over endless lifetimes. So do we have to go and experience all the effects, right? All the effects. One interesting thing is that for all these karmas to ripen, that there needs to be a base, and the base is, of course, the mind. When you change the mind, then it is possible that you don't need to experience all the results of the past karmas, that we have accumulated over endless lifetimes. And then, how do we change our mind? Like in the case of when we try to meditate, I think it is important that we don't really think too much about the past. I think that's very important, because if we try to think too much about the past, then I think that might hinder in our development. So we know that in the past we have done lots of negative things, right? When I say past, I mean like past lifetimes. So then what's important is that we need to think about the present and work on that. The present is very important, and we must make good use of our time. And of course, if we try to meditate on something, then we somehow we face some obstacle, that our mind has this tendency to sort of divert from the meditative state. It has a tendency to divert to another object that is not that is not the focal point. When that happens, we should not sort of stop the meditation and then leave. This is very important. That if we do that, then that will, of course, obviously, be an obstacle to meditating further. So, again, then we should try to go back onto the object of meditation, apply mindfulness, being mindful. I think that sometimes I have doubts about when we say that the mind does not, it lost or it got distracted from the object of meditation due to distractions. That term, I think, is little. It seems a little strange to me, because it's not like distraction came from afar and then sort of diverted the mind, but the mind got diverted and it was voluntary. It seems to be our nature of our present mind that it does not like to focus on one thing for too long. It's in this state of, it's this constant state of influx. It's ever changing, right? So I don't think it would be correct to think of distractions as having something that's very separate from our mind. It is our present mind's nature that it's ever flowing, that it's ever changing, that it needs to hop around, So when we become distracted, when we become distracted, then try to go back to the same object. Now, with the result of the karmas, by having the method aspect and the wisdom aspect, then we are making the mind in a way less conducive to the ripening of karma. Because how karma ripens is not just that, it's not just only that we have committed some action, that we have committed some action in the past that it will inevitably rise. That's not the case, that clashes are the condition for the karmas to rise. And through wisdom and the method aspect, when one gradually overcomes klesha, destructive emotions, mental afflictions, when one gradually overcomes those the grosser level and then the more subtle mental afflictions, then one can become free from going through the experience of all those karmas effects. So without having the wisdom aspect, then I think it will be very difficult to stop the ripening of past karmas. Of course, one can apply the four antidotes. But that still does not overcome all past karmas, That still does not overcome all past karmas. That's mainly for, I think, the more negative karmas, And many of the ripening of karma is not necessarily the negative karmas, but the other karmas. For example, the meritorious karma, like that. Meritorious, yeah. So for that, we don't apply the four opponent powers, but we have to rely on the right view to overcome that category of karma. Mindfulness is a very important thing, right? Many times we are not mindful and we make lots of mistakes. So we need to be mindful, being mindful of the matter at hand, being mindful of our emotions, I could say, being mindful of our motivation, so mindfulness is another important component in training our mind, in training our mind. It's not an easy thing to do. To practice Dharma, is not an easy thing to do, because it's all about trying to go against our natural instincts, And we really have to make an effort and always try to sort of what's the word? That we need to tackle all those emotions, those mental afflictions. It is almost as if those afflictions are like our second skin. They're like the second skin of our consciousness, of our mind, and they always seem to accompany us, right? And That's why, practicing the Dharma is not an easy thing to do. But if you can sort of apply something, apply the Dharma, apply some teaching when you are having that experience, and if it works one time, then that gives, then there is some hope, there is some hope. And then you can try to apply that in a different situation, right? So we have to always experiment. We have to always experiment. We have to always experiment like that. And it's important not to be overwhelmed, but to be hopeful and to have to be inspired in facing up to the challenge of overcoming negative emotions, of subduing ourselves. So we always have to make an effort to do that. Your question was that? Oh, okay. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
There's no easy way out, and the teachings will motivate to make an effort.
Mm-hmm.
It's not pleasant to struggle. Sometimes I feel like I'm going against the current, not with the current. Sometimes I feel like an ant crawling up the wall, and then I slip down, and then I go back up the wall. And sometimes I feel like I want to surrender to the effort because it's quite exhausting. But I have to face reality, if in fact there's no way out but to make that effort and determination, motivation, then I have to go with that. And yes, thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Rinpoche, I was wondering if you can elaborate, please, a little bit on dependent origination.
Dependent origination, the reasoning for emptiness. I think there are 5 different types of reasonings, and dependent origination. The reason of that is the 5th one, right? It's the 5th, and sometimes we call that the king of reasonings. The king of reasonings. So, to know emptiness, when we think of emptiness, then we have to be careful that we don't make the mistake of getting the wrong idea, right? So, there are 2 pitfalls, right? So, the 2 extremes, the 2 pitfalls that if you're not careful, then we might come to the conclusion that there really is a truly existing phenomena. That's one extreme, and then the other extreme is that after all the analysis, after devoting our time to endless reasonings, then we might come to the point that things don't exist at all, that it was just a mere labeling, or it was just a mere, that it was really our conceptual thoughts that were thinking, but beyond that, there things don't exist. We might also come to that conclusion. So that's the other extreme. And using dependent origination as the case for why things don't have this intrinsic nature is very effective at making sure that one doesn't, that the reasoner does not fall in those two pitfalls. Because when we say dependent arising, because the object of our analysis is dependent, therefore it cannot have an intrinsic nature, right? And because it originates from a cause, therefore it exists. If it doesn't exist, then how would it arise out of causes and conditions? And if it arises if it is dependent on causes and conditions, then how can it have its own intrinsic property, because it has arisen from something else. So that's why that reasoning is called the king of all reasonings. There are different understandings of dependent origination. Praditya Samutpata, different philosophical systems within Buddhism have different understandings of dependent origination. On a more grosser level, dependent origination refers primarily to things that mainly to impermanent things. It would apply only to things that has a cause, that arises out of causation. So the classic example would be, fire and smoke, right? Smoke is the effect, fire is the cause. So that is a classic example. And then dependent origination on a more subtler level refers to how that things are not only dependent on a cause that preceded it, but somehow they are also dependent on their own parts. So in the house, so let's say the house, then it is dependent on its parts, right? Without those parts, then there wouldn't be a house. So here, when we say dependent arising or origination, then the house arises out of its parts, not just the causes that preceded it. And then dependent origination on a more subtler level is that is the relation between the object and the subject, the subjective experience. How, even though to our mind, that when we perceive an object, it may seem as though we are perceiving an object that is independent of our subjective experience. But there is no object without a subject. There is no a subjective experience without an object, right? So those two things are dependent on each other. I think that is the more subtle dependent origination. And I think also the concept of dependent origination can be applied onto many things, that need not necessarily that need not be necessary part of like dharma. So even like on more secular things that can be applied in economics, etc. Lots of things, right? In our relation with people, I think this is very important. Dependent origination. If we can apply that in our relation with, with our friends, even with our enemies, then I think this would be very effective. Because if you think about it, we are dependent on other people. We are social animals. And like the clothes that we wear, that lots of people have contributed in that. Even if we get like a bottle of water, again, many people have contributed to that. To the untrained person, or to when we are not very mindful of that fact, then it may appear as though things just sort of fall into place by themselves, and that everything somehow just falls into place for us. But that's not the case. So it's very good if we can use our understanding of dependent origination in these aspects, because ultimately our understanding of dharma or emptiness or dependent origination needs to be effective. It needs to be useful in our daily lives, that there shouldn't be some high philosophical things up there, that we shouldn't put them high up in some shelves. That we should take these understandings and then apply them for very basic things, because only on the basic level then we can change. That the change does not come on the high level, that it has to come right now. It has to come when we are doing small things. I had some thoughts, but now it's gone. Your question was about like elaborate on dependent origination, right? Mm. Hmm. Maybe it will come back. So maybe we'll go with the next question.
Is it on? My question is, can the consciousness exist simultaneously in one universe and in a parallel universe?
I think that's possible. Um, like when you say a parallel universe, are you referring to a universe where it's like a mirror copy of this universe, so that there would be countless me's, or there would be many people like this? Do you mean like that when you say parallel, or do you just mean could there be a whole another universe, right? Okay, yes, I think that's possible. Of course, one universe is already so big, and we cannot. It's very difficult to see for ourselves how big our universe really is. So in a way, it's really like out of my mind, but I don't think we can rule out the possibility that there are other universes around. Yeah.
When you have a dream, for an example, and you wake up and that dream seems, you say to yourself, that really seems real.
Hmm.
It's, in fact, when you're sometimes in that dream,
Okay.
it's completely real.
Right.
And you're unaware of this consciousness.
Right. Okay. When we dream, things appear much more real, right? Of course, there are exceptional cases where the person dreaming, goes in a parallel world, or travels into a different country through dreaming. So there are some phenomenal cases, but usually, like when we have a dream and it appears somehow very real, in those cases, then I think that when, so we have the 6 consciousnesses, and when the sense consciousnesses, when the sense consciousness stops, then somehow the 6th consciousness is more enhanced in that way, and they can experience things more vividly, yeah. So that when we come out of the dream state, then we feel as though we have been with the person, or that we had visited that place, right? It is, I think, that we have had a very vivid experience, had a very vivid consciousness at that time. But when we have the sense consciousness, when those are when we go through, when we experience them simultaneously with the 6th consciousness, then it doesn't have that same level of perception, of clear perception as in in a dream state. But yes, there are these cases of people that like traveling to other countries when they were sleeping. Yeah, so I've had uh, I've had I heard from people that they know these people that who have actually been through these experiences. So I think that's really interesting. But I've not had that experience, so I cannot really elaborate. Nor do I have seen texts or things about this, so I cannot. I don't want to speculate too much, right? Yeah. Okay. So, next question.
I hear oftentimes or read oftentimes that the wisdom realizing emptiness is a non-affirming negation. And I'm just wondering, and I know I've asked this in teaching before, but I just, for myself, like to make it clear, the object of negation, is it, to me, it seems that there is this automatic, impulsive labeling. It's not even so much labeling, but a feeling when you bring something to mind, when you perceive something that makes it feel maybe concrete. Is that instinct or impulse one of the primary objects or impulses or automatic tendencies that we are trying to negate when we are meditating on emptiness?
Differentiating between the object of negation and what is not the object of negation, differentiating that is a big task, you know. First of all, what is the object of negation? You know, that is a big question. And with our experience, someone who has not experienced shunyata, emptiness, can that person differentiate, you know, the object of negation from the others? When an object appears to our mind, I wouldn't say at that point this avidya, ignorance, has arise then. First, the appearance of the object starts, and then gradually then it somehow appears as something more solid, right? More concrete. And what does like this concrete, solid thing mean? It means that it appears as though it is whatever that we are trying to, whatever it is that we are perceiving, it appears as though it is that, from its own side. And that is, of course, that is the object of negation, right? So just the mere perception of an object is not the object of negation, but when you are seeing that object from its own base, that is the object of negation, yeah? But explaining like this might make some sense, but how do you apply that on a practical level, When you're out on the street and looking around, then how do you know when this ignorance arises, or how do you know when the intro, what's the word? Incontrovertible? What's the word? Right? When that perception is there, or whether you are really grasping this object, right? Then it becomes more difficult, right? So that's when we have to rely on the texts. That's when we have to rely on those sources and then try to differentiate between these. First, we cannot differentiate these things by experience because we have not experienced emptiness, right? If you haven't experienced emptiness, then how can you really differentiate what is the object of negation and what is not the object of negation by experience, right? You cannot do that. You cannot differentiate that by experience, but rather you have to try to differentiate that by way of reasoning. Yeah, by way of reasoning. So, using logic, and then try to differentiate those on a more conceptual level, or on a more understanding level. But if you try to ask these questions, then again we always run into the same problem, Of course, there are views that ascribe that the mere perception of a thing is indeed ignorance, right? That is again, I think, one method, yeah? Making that statement that things are neither existing or non-existing, again has a very deep knowledge behind that statement. If someone makes that statement without truly knowing the meaning of that statement, then it is erroneous. Then if someone uses some logic, then it might be self-contradicting. But if you know the meaning behind that statement, that things don't exist, things are neither existing nor non-existing, if you truly know the meaning behind that, then it's perfectly okay to use that statement, right? So, if you take that very literally, then all conceptual thoughts are then they have to be negated. Yeah? If you think like that, then all conceptual thoughts have to be negated. Some other traditions, of course, do not support that viewpoint, but nevertheless, they accept that with conceptual thoughts, even though there might be, even though they accept that conceptual thoughts can also be somewhat like positive, but nevertheless, they still have some level of delusion, and that they are affected, or they are correlated with ignorance, and that their appearance would always be somehow flawed, that they will always have a flawed perception. So it's interesting that with both these two philosophical systems, somehow conceptual thoughts in the end have to be sort of overcome. They have to be like left behind, and that the conceptual thoughts need to be, that they need to transition into a non-conceptual state. Yeah. But for us beginners, we have to start with conceptual thoughts. We have to start with those understanding, that we cannot sort of like directly jump into the non-conceptual area just yet. But we have to when we think of this self-grasping mind, it's always on a conceptual level. Yeah, the self-grasping mind is always conceptual. But not all self-perceiving consciousness have to be conceptual. We make that distinction, right? So with our sense consciousness, if they are influenced by ignorance, then of course they will also perceive this quality. So they are also self-perceiving consciousness, but still they are not self-grasping, They are not grasping this self, because they are non-conceptual. So the non-conceptual consciousness can perceive the self. When I say self, of course, I'm referring to the intrinsic qualities, right? I'm referring to this intrinsic nature. Yeah. So, if a consciousness perceives the table as if it was a table from its own side, then that would be perceiving the self of the table. Yeah? I think there might when people hear the word self, they're always applying it like to a person, right? But again, here when we say self, we can apply that to any object, right? And it's the same thing in Tibetan. For self, we say da, and again, for normally when we say da, we usually mean me, right? Me or myself, right? We would usually refer to that. But in the case of anatman and the object of negation, in the context of anatman, self, then we're referring to this inherent quality. We're not talking about a person at all. So there's a difference between self-perceiving consciousness and self-grasping consciousness. The first 5 consciousness, because they are non-conceptual, they don't grasp a self, even though they do perceive a self. Now, in the 6th consciousness, that's when things become, I think, less clear-cut, and that's when these different interpretations or different understandings come into play, right? So you have conceptual thoughts that can grasp, that have the potential to grasp an object. So when they are perceiving this self, then it's much more likely that because they can perceive the self and also they can grasp, therefore they can also be self-grasping, right? So that leaves the door for that possibility, and therefore certain schools, certain philosophical systems would say that all conceptual thoughts would also are also self-grasping, right? And therefore they're also, I think, ignorance, yeah? And they need to be overcome. The other system does not say that, but nevertheless does accept that all conceptual thoughts are somehow in a way flawed, yeah? That they would always, that by their nature they would perceive a self nevertheless. If we try to analyze our experience, if we try to do like this experiment with ourselves, here I'm in this room, I can see everyone, and we can see each other. During the whole time, since I came and sat on this chair, did the self-grasping mind arise? If I were to ask that, it would be very difficult to deny that, It would be very difficult to say that didn't arise. But then if it did arise, then would I be able to sort of pinpoint, that was the moment that I had that experience, It would be very difficult. Why? Because I was trying to focus on you all, I wasn't trying to I wasn't trying to analyze my mind, right? So therefore I'm not in a good position to say whether I really had that experience or not, because I was looking to outwards. Now if you sort of go in a secluded place and then try to find that point when self-grasping mind arises, if you try to sort of like catch that, catch the mind red-handed, then again I think the ignorance is very smart, it's very clever, and will sort of go into hiding. It seems that it will not sort of show itself. So when we are sort of engrossed in the object, then it is clear that it arises then. But if we try to look back to ourselves, then we cannot really find it. It only comes when you're really engrossed, when you're really sort of like absorbed into the object. It's like trying to, we all know this emotion, anger, right? We have all been angry at one point or another. But can we really say the exact moment when we became angry? Can we really find out the exact moment when anger arose? It's difficult, right? We know it, but we cannot sort of say from this point it started and this point it ended. Maybe ending might be more easier, but the starting point, to really pinpoint that, I think is more difficult. Because if you were really aware of whether anger has arisen or not, or whether if you're really aware of your emotions, then it's likely that anger wouldn't arise in the first place, right? It's only when you're really absorbed out there that it somehow it just comes about, right? With of course the right conditions and causes there, then it will arise. So likewise, I think it's something similar with trying to pinpoint the self-grasping mind. Yeah. But nevertheless, we must make that fine distinction of, conventional reality and ultimate reality, and how those two are compatible. And yes, now I got it. When you were asking that question about dependent origination, I wanted to say that dependent origination and emptiness go hand in hand. They complement each other, that they do not contradict each other. With that, from the Heart Sutra, form is empty, emptiness is form, right? That's a very powerful teaching, Form is empty of this inherent quality. Form is empty of that formness, yeah. And because form does not have this true nature, that it does not have this intrinsic quality, therefore form can exist. Emptiness is form, that because form does not have this intrinsic nature, then it is possible for it to arise out of causes and conditions. So emptiness is perhaps like a more negative side, and dependent origination is the more positive side, So they are both two sides of the same coin. In the classical texts, of course, that's always the procedure, that before realizing emptiness, that it is important to know what we are trying to negate. Yeah, so that's like standard procedure. But for me, if you really know what you are trying to negate, then it's almost like you already know emptiness, right? So that may seem a little contradicting, but it is not contradicting, that there is a fine line between those two. Okay. Next question.
Thank you, Rinpoche. Sorry.
Please.
Oh, stand. Oh, okay. Sorry. My question is kind of related to what you've just been speaking about. It's how do we move from a conceptual understanding of emptiness to direct perception or direct realization of emptiness? And my second part of the question is, once a being has achieved a direct realization of emptiness, is that a permanent state? Meaning, do they forget about it, or are they done creating negative karmas at that point? Are they totally liberated once you get a direct perception?
Thank you.
Thank you.
From understanding emptiness conceptually to realizing emptiness non-conceptually, a direct perception. Before we go from that point to the other point, there are many hurdles on the way, right? There are many hurdles. So we have to be aware that, first of all, having a good understanding of emptiness is already quite difficult enough, right? And when one gets, when one infers emptiness by way of reasoning, then one has an inferential knowledge, and this knowledge is quite similar to many of our other inferential knowledges, except the main difference would just be the object, right? So in this case, it would be obviously emptiness, what we are inferring. So from that point on, then the person who has understood emptiness then has to continue. Right now it's just on a very superficial level, so the person then meditates on that. So habituating with the object, habituating with that understanding, because inferential knowledge can be momentary. You know it, and then the next moment you are thinking of something completely different, right? So if it always tunes in and tunes out all the time, then it doesn't have much weight, so to speak. So we have to meditate on emptiness. Yeah? Even if we do understand emptiness on a like inferential level, without having a certain level of analysis and stabilization, then it would be impossible to transition into the direct perception. So shamatha and vipassana, one then proceeds into generating that. shamatha and vipassana, those two are very important. That if we really want to make an effort in going deep or in overcoming negative emotions, then without shamatha and vipassana, we cannot do that, We cannot do that. Because we will always be distracted. And shamatha and vipassana is in a way sort of like training the mind, training the mind to be stable, training the mind to analyze. What's the English word? Is it pliancy? Xinjiang di pliancy. Pliancy. So, after getting this knowledge of emptiness, then we primarily use single-pointed concentration, and when one does that over a certain time, then when the person is able to gain pliancy by way of single-pointed concentration, then that's when the person attains shamatha. But then attaining shamatha alone is not sufficient, because if one then continues to analyze, then somehow it is distracting. So one would then need to follow the instructions, and when the meditator is able to generate when one is able to attain pliancy by way of analysis, then that's when vipassana is attained. And with these two, then continuing those two factor meditations, then one gradually goes through the four different types of the path of connecting, and then gradually we say that conceptual thoughts have the image of the object, between it and its object, right? Through attaining the four sub-parts of the path of connecting, then the mental image, sort of the clarity of the mental image, then degenerates, and the object itself gradually becomes clearer. And when the mental image diminishes completely, that's when the direct perception of emptiness is achieved. So before we jump from those 2 points, first we have to attain, shamatha and vipassana. That's quite a difficult thing to do. So we do that. Maybe, okay, now, are there any more questions, or?
Would that be the ninth stage of shamatha? There's the stages of shamatha. Does it have to be at the ninth stage, or could somebody achieve it at a...
Shamatha, I think, is attained at the tenth stage. At the 10th stage, these 9 stages are the causes, they are the different states of mind that is now getting sort of closer to shamatha. You're talking of the 9 stages, like the fixation, like that, right? Fixing the attention and then continuously fixing like that, you mean, right? These are the 9 stages you're talking about, right?
Shamatha, to achieve shamatha.
Oh, okay. So then shamatha is the 10th stage. Yeah.
And it's only in that stage that we could have this non-conceptual realization of emptiness?
Yes, and not having shamatha does not mean that you have attained the direct perception of emptiness, or even shamatha on emptiness. If someone has attained shamatha on emptiness, then that doesn't equate direct perception. So after shamatha, then you have to attain the vipassana. Not just vipassana, but again vipassana on emptiness. And still, at this level, it's still conceptual, right? So one has to, again, like sort of purify, go through the purification part again, and go through that process. Yeah. So, like, okay, so with the 5 parts, the transition from the path of accumulation to path of connecting is when the person who has attained the first path, whenever the person, let's say, whenever the person gains shamatha and vipassana, or the union of shamatha and vipassana on emptiness, that's when the transition happens, and then one has to go through the 4 types, the 4 levels of the path of connecting, and within these levels, then there are varying degrees of the perception of emptiness. It becomes more clearer, and the mental image gradually diminishes, and when it diminishes, that's direct perception. Yes. So when we say direct, it means that there is no mental image in between the object and itself. Okay, that's it. Okay. So, so then I will stop now, and it's very important, that in our normal lives, that whenever we listen to the Dharma, or whenever we just do anything, that we should try to do with some good motivation, some positive thoughts, and when we accomplish something, at the end, that we must always make the right dedication. This is very important. So whatever, of course, like in the sutras, they say that even listening to emptiness, brings huge amounts of merit. Just listening, just trying to, you don't have to think, but just listening to emptiness brings about so much positive things. So we should always dedicate our merits, of course, to all sentient beings, so that they may be free from the cyclic existence. That's very important, and of course, we should dedicate so that the Dharma can spread, so that Dharma can benefit people. And for that, of course, we need our gurus to do that. So, we should dedicate so that, and always pray that our lamas, that our gurus will live long, and continue to inspire us. This is very important. So there are so many lamas. There are so many gurus in our universe, right? So His Holiness is a shining example of that, and let us all dedicate and pray for his health, long life, and may he continue to inspire us. May he continue to inspire us in our endeavor, in our journey. You could say in our journey. So we should do that, and thank you all for your interest in the Dharma. Thank you.